Today on the Wrestling Roundtable, Puroresu, Japanese pro wrestling, and the best and worst hardcore wrestlers. Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable. Joining our panel to my left, which is your right, is Lawrence Haber, music composer and fan of over 20 years. And we've got very special guests this week, two wrestlers from Ring of Honor. Shane Hagedorn, who's been a fan of wrestling 23 years and wrestling for the past 5. And of course, returning to the panel once again is Alex Payne, fan of 22 years, and he's been wrestling about 3.5. Before we move on to our talk about Puroresu, Japanese pro wrestling, which we did plan on talking about sometime in the future, but not only have people been requesting when are we going to talk about that, after Mitsuharu Misawa died in the ring a couple months ago, I thought it would be more appropriate to talk about it now. But of course, before we move on, I want to let you know that you should go to WrestlingRoundtable.com. If you want to supply a column, do so. We'll print it in the guest column section. Sign up for the message board, post your thoughts about the show, and you can also request us as a friend on MySpace and our Facebook. And you can support the Wrestling Roundtable by going to the store on WrestlingRoundtable.com and getting the Wrestling Roundtable t-shirt. Of course, you can find out more about Ring of Honor on ROHWrestling.com. But Ring of Honor has had a partnership with Pro Wrestling Noah, Japanese pro wrestling, in the past few years, and we've seen a lot of Japanese wrestlers in a talent trade sort of situation come over and have some awesome matches. But I don't want to get specific just yet. I want to talk about Puro, as the smart marks call it, in more of a general sense. Now, we know that Japan, as a culture, as a country, has a big combat history. Lots of martial arts have started in Japan and sprung off into other forms later on, and everybody knows the reputation of Japanese wrestling fans taking it much more serious, being much more respectful, which is part of the Japanese culture anyway, it being printed in the newspapers the next day. But when you go back in history and see how pro wrestling evolved in Japan, along with mixed martial arts, you'll see that pro wrestling didn't exactly take off immediately, and it really started taking up in the 50s. Mainly because of Korean-born star Rikidozan. So wrestling getting hot in the 50s, the catalyst obviously is Rikidozan because it needed this star, much like Hogan did in the 80s, to become the leader of this movement. But do you think it also had something to do with this patriotic sense of rebuilding after World War II?
Oh, definitely. I mean, half of what they did with Rikidozan when he first started was they put him over Americans. They put him over a big string of Americans, built him up into this big Japanese conqueror, getting revenge, a very nationalistic symbol, kind of, I guess, Hogan, real American hero. He was hero.
Fighting spirit. This samurai Bushido based, because it was an isolationist country for several hundred years until the mid-1800s. Then people started becoming exposed to this warrior class of the samurai. So they've always had this sort of fighting culture, and you can see these elements pop up in Puro. But what makes you a fan of Puroresu? What attracted you after growing up watching American wrestling?
Japanese wrestling always seemed more realistic. They presented professional wrestling as a sport. They weren't too showy. They weren't doing all the glitzy and glamour stuff. They report the results, say, in the newspaper like you're talking about. They presented pro wrestling in a very fundamental sport for everyone to understand and people to take seriously, as opposed to the cartoony stuff that you see here in America.
Now, Lawrence, you introduced me to Japanese wrestling first when we met 12 years ago. You gave me a best of Liger and a best of Ultimo comp from Uncle Howie. What attracted you to watching this unique form of product, so different from what we're used to?
Just the moves, just to start as a kid. I had seen a little bit of that in ECW, and of course you see the occasional power bomb in 1992. But it wasn't to the level in Japan where everybody of all shapes and sizes and abilities was able to do these things that you, as a kid, it would be cool if you lifted the guy over your head, something you do in a video game.
The wrestling there was very evolved and very fresh compared to what you're seeing on 90s professional wrestling.
And I'm not even talking about what we call strong style, just the fact that these tiger bombs and things off the top rope I'd never seen before, much less what Dynamite Kid and athletes like that were able to do, the risks they were taking. You would never see that in any of the territories or certainly the national wrestling television.
Stampede.
There was that talent trade with Stu Hart, and there were a lot of Japanese influences, not just with the talent, but also in the style.
But certainly in WWF and the NWA and the AWA, it wasn't as common. It wasn't in the main event. That's for sure.
necessarily.
So that's agreed.
Well, it's crazy too how closely tied some of the American companies were. Like WWF was really closely tied
To New Japan.
To New Japan. They gave them 3 of their belts that they never really acknowledged in the States and said defend them here. They actually had some sort of a contractual agreement there. They just never really took advantage of it in the United States. They even gave titles to people, you know?
Well, they did have Tiger Mask and Dynamite Kid in MSG,
Yeah.
which is still ahead of its time if
Yeah,
you watch it
In
now.
context,
Yeah.
that's one of the most bizarre, surreal things to ever see.
You can't imagine that happening in a pre-Hogan era, let alone a post-Hogan
No,
era.
just in those matches, like the sheer speed that they go, the moves they're doing.
The world was not, the
mind-blowing.
States were not ready for that.
No,
No.
God, no.
I mean, they're reacting.
Too much too fast. I think it was almost a freak show atmosphere for the fans
Well,
of
junior
MSG.
heavyweight, like, I don't know if you're gonna say freak show in the sense like a midget or a big guy, but for that sense, it's out there for people to see these guys wrestling at that pace.
Well, speaking of freak shows, part of the Japanese culture is also being influenced and taking an aspect of different cultures and absorbing it into their own. Now, we have this groundwork laid for decades of the Japanese pro wrestling style. But then in the 80s and 90s and into now, you see these indie promotions crop up that take these other aspects, these other takes of pro wrestling to extremes. You've got ultra violent shit like Big Japan and FMW. You've got the lucha influenced stuff primarily from Ultimo Dragon and all of his students who started dojos and promotions like Torimon and Monkey Strangling Championship Wrestling. But you also have comedy stuff that is the complete opposite of this serious sports stuff, like DDT and Hustle with the Invisible Man and Mecha Mummy and 8-year-old girls chokeslamming people.
Yeah, they do mix in, though. I can say I haven't seen a whole lot of Hustle. With DDT, they do also mix in Chicken Hustle. They also mix in some of the more serious matches.
Low key against Brian Kendrick for NWA junior titles. I've seen those matches where they're took seriously. I've seen Kawada versus Cactus headline, and it's a serious match on these hustle shows. They try to put together an all-around card, almost like a WrestleMania in some ways for them.
And they do have ridiculous shit, like the one card I saw where the stipulation for the match was the loser gets taken back to the other guy's hotel room and raped.
Or a guy has
That
to
was the
wrestle an egg.
stipulation for the match.
Isn't that every match in Japan?
possibly? Oh yeah, and then Tajiri wrestled an egg.
That's the
Yeah.
training.
Another extreme is the work shoot stuff, like UWFI, and that could possibly be an interesting premonition of what happened with this MMA versus pro wrestling stuff in Japan, because they tried doing this work shoot stuff with UWFI, and a lot of people, like when Rodney on the panel saw it the first time, didn't even know it was worked. It looked that stiff, it looked that real. But eventually, Pride shows up, real MMA shows up, and I think Inoki is to blame for a lot of stuff in
yeah.
Japan because he was always searching for that legitimacy, fighting the boxer, he's fighting the wrestler, he's fighting the judoka, he's fighting the wrestling
Ali
guy.
match.
But the point is that he was trying to get pro wrestling that credibility, and that's why he started, I believe, going into this Inoki Bumbaye route of doing more work shoot stuff and pushing pro wrestlers to do more MMA sort of stuff. And a lot of them pretty much got embarrassed, with some exceptions like Sakuraba. But eventually, with this New Japan UWF feud and New Japan trying to squash this work shoot sort of stuff, eventually Pride pops up. And pro wrestling in Japan isn't exactly doing too well right now across the board with the big three. Not as good as it used to, at least. Is that
But is that more of the booking as opposed to mixed martial arts really hurting it though?
I'm saying that it's almost a parallel to what we're seeing in
It's
America
definitely a
now
parallel.
with mixed martial arts and pro wrestling. Pro wrestling isn't doing bad per se, but it's certainly not doing as
But is
well
there
as
really a major mixed martial arts company in Japan right now that's doing great?
not right now.
Well, there's a portion of the audience that does watch MMA and wrestling. You can tell in big part by how they advertise. It's two separate things. So I don't really know if the MMA world in Japan has affected the pro wrestling world. I know a lot of it comes from the fact that the companies haven't done a lot to elevate people, which is reflected here too. Muda is still on top. Kobashi, Misawa, up until obviously he died.
We're going
A
to
lot of
cover
the
that when we come back because we're going to talk some more about Puroresu when we return.
If you love the submissions and mixed martial arts, you love submission grappling already, you don't even know it yet.
皆さんこんにちは、プロレスリングノアの健太です、レスリングラウンドテーブル絶対見逃さないように。
Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable. We were just talking about Japanese pro wrestling, Puroresu, and one of the things you were talking about as we were ending our last segment was the fact that maybe business not being so great in Japan right now has something to do with them not building up bigger stars. Now, I find that hilarious because there's so many people out there that say, I can't stand American stuff anymore, I just watch Japanese pro wrestling. Now, it's a obviously very different physical style. That's cool, but isn't Japanese wrestling promotions guilty of the same problem as American ones, where they've had the same people on top for probably 10 years at this point, guys who have been wrestling 20 years? And could that even be a factor in Misawa's death?
Part of it is it's a different structure too. It seems
There's no ball washing in America?
There's like a pecking order.
Yeah, like,
Nice pun.
Yeah, there you go. Like there's a mindset of you need to earn it. You're expected to wrestle for 5 years as a junior before you're allowed to move up to being a heavyweight, and then you have to put in your time as a heavyweight before we're going to put you into the title picture, and then you got to put in your time challenging before you ever actually win the title. It's a structure that's been there for a long time, and they've adhered to it
Too much?
Yeah, exactly. They've adhered to it too much, to the point that you still have Kobashi as one of Noah's biggest draws.
He can barely walk.
When his knees are shot.
Right.
Misawa still was probably their biggest draw. And
his spine's cut in half now.
Exactly. The same thing that happened to Christopher Reeve. It was pretty much what his injury ended up being. Muda's still on top for them.
How many more tournaments can Tenzan and Chono win?
You know, it's still... And there are some people that have moved up, like Tanahashi, but Tanahashi's been wrestling for like 10 years before
look
he
at
got up to
Kojima.
there.
Like, he took
Kojima
forever,
is
15 years to
one.
win the championship. Minoru Suzuki, those guys.
But this pecking order you're talking about only applies in American wrestling seemingly when they want to hold somebody down.
Yeah.
Because if there's someone like Austin who's been wrestling 8 years, it took me 8 years to get here, then that seems like a Japanese sort of way. But then when they want to push someone like Brock and Angle, there you go.
Yeah.
It's only when they have someone like Taz that they don't want to push because he's 5 foot
I guess
nothing.
if they have a plan for you, then they're going to go full force with you. If they don't, then you're kind of stuck for a while.
So they give him like a test run, like Marufuji's GHC title reign seemed almost like a test run, just to see how he would do with in that
Like
position.
Punk.
Yeah, like Punk's first.
It was
run.
fresh, it was new. They weren't going to go balls to the wall with it, but they gave you a little run, and you got to drop the title to Misawa at the end.
I don't think a test run for a belt ever works in wrestling.
You don't test that shit,
You're
you
either
do it.
good or you're not. You don't have test World Series.
Yeah.
It's a test.
You're mentioning a lot of young guys that people think should be main eventing, so they could qualify as some of your favorite Japanese wrestlers, and let's talk about that. Who are your favorite Japanese wrestlers overall?
Muda. He always had a unique look, great wrestling.
He
was
seems
awesome.
like Undertaker of Japan in a way, and by that I mean
Always
he's
able
been
to reinvent himself.
yes, always reinventing himself, always over the course of 20 years, and still manages with style changes to put in some good matches.
Well, at one point, everyone thought he was done. Early 2000, everyone thought he was done, and then he won this phenomenal run to become the Triple Crown champion again. Some of my favorite matches come from that run.
It's like Michaels, like a resurrection.
Oh, and there was one thing they used to say is Muda at the time. Good job.
Puns all over
Enough
that.
phallus jokes here.
But Muda at the time, his was
That was a religious one.
Yeah, it was.
Same
mirrored
thing.
Austin. Muda's run mirrored Austin at the time because they were kind of that
Didn't
same
win.
career resurgence. Unfortunately, Muda's still wrestling in Austin, is making bad movies.
Liger.
But Liger,
That's my guy.
The look. What an unbelievable.
I mean, it's way out there, but it's so cool.
But that's what's cool about it. But another one like Muda, who came into the States and just lit it up.
Innovator.
I mean, similarly like Mysterio coming from Mexico and being able to do it, whereas Ultimo Dragon, not so much. They just had that it factor and were able
He had
to
a
make
mystique
it.
to him, which
and
made
mystique
him a look. It made him such like a draw.
And
across
ability.
the board.
Tiger Mask.
Sayama, the original?
Yes.
Which one?
And Masawa. Both.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those are the two I've seen the most of. I haven't seen a lot of Kanimoto as Tiger Mask 3 and
I like
not much.
Tiger Mask 4. He's
I
not bad
haven't
at all.
seen a whole lot of Tiger Mask 4 stuff either because I haven't seen much Japanese in the last year.
Now, a lot of fans are going to say the usual Kobashis, that's great, Masawas, but of that All Japan sort of group, my favorite was always Toshiaki Kawada.
Yeah.
Because I just loved seeing him kick people full force in the face. And speaking of that, a lot of the younger guys that are coming up now, Marufuji's really good, but Kenta really stands out above all to me.
Kenta reminds me a lot of Kawada. Kawada coming up, it was him, Masawa. Masawa was the one who had the Tiger Mask. He kind of had the rocket strapped to him, and whereas Kawada was in the States, working in Canada in freezing cold weather for no money, and he was miserable, and he came back to Japan, that bitter guy. And Kenta, so much of his mannerisms and the way he carries himself reminds me of that, especially when he first started. You know, they put him in this trial series where he had to fight Kobashi and Marufuji and
The hotness.
the hotness, exactly.
Takayama.
And that whole run, he had that same like bitter attitude that Kawada always has, and I see a lot of Kawada in Kenta, even though Kenta was more like Kobashi's protege.
Unlike what the internet thinks, Japan is not perfect, so there is another side to the coin. What were some of the worst pro wrestlers?
I cannot stand watching Akira Taue.
Me neither.
Although I can say better than now, but still.
I don't get it.
No,
It's just this
he's-
big lug. He's like the Kali of Japan. He just comes in and chokes
yeah,
like him. It really
it's
sucks.
like a bad impersonation of like a Nokian Baba.
Teo Kia. You really
Yeah.
know him. He's just this
Yeah.
big,
Oh,
like,
really
jacked
bad.
up Asian guy, not good at all. Don't know why he's been around. He's been wrestling in All Japan for probably a good 10 years or better, and he seems to be Muda's guy or what, but he seems to always be in the main events. He got the Triple Crown. I don't know how the hell that happened. It's an abomination almost.
Chono. I just don't like Chono.
Really?
Yeah.
He's a great wrestler. He's a star there, but he just seems to have this political sense about him where he's always positioning himself, which you got to respect to a degree that somebody can be that evil. There's other people that could be there in that position, and they aren't because he is.
If we can go back to the 90s for a little bit, Gato sucked. I know
No, he got better. He got a lot
right,
better.
but
as
when he
progressed,
started,
but
he was pretty terrible. But I want to go to FMW. If there's one guy, he just makes my blood boil. It's Mr. Pogo.
Pogo.
What the fuck is that piece
Another-
of shit?
Down that same
He had
line,
a
Wade
scythe.
Kanemura. I wasn't a
he
fan
had a
of him
scythe
either.
and he stabbed you. There you go.
Let's get back onto something positive. What were your favorite Japanese matches? Japanese wrestler versus Japanese wrestler in Japan.
Masao and Kawada from Noah's Destiny show.
Not
It
the
was-
earlier ones?
No, well, those are all good too. It was the first time that they'd wrestled in years, which, by the way, is another thing WWF completely fails upon.
Like Michaels and Undertaker.
That's why it was important. They hadn't wrestled in 10 years.
Right.
You know, Masao and Kawada hadn't wrestled in years, but this match played off all of their history. They had a scoreboard in the corner of the match that said how many times Masao had won, how many times Kawada had won, and how many times they drawed. There was a huge sense of history behind this match, and I was exhausted when I finished watching this match because it was emotionally
Flopping?
draining. Exactly. It was emotionally draining. It was so physical, and all the history. It was just, wow.
All right, I didn't mean the flopping joke. That's what American fans did to Michaels Undertaker.
That's true.
Kenta Marufuji for the GHC heavyweight title.
In 06?
In 06. Once Marufuji got the title, they put him against his biggest nemesis. And I've seen plenty of other matches for the junior titles. I've seen the wrestlers as tag team partners for the junior tag titles. Once they got in the ring to actually put on an awesome heavyweight title match, to this day I think it holds up.
I mentioned Toshiaki Kawada before, and of course the Masawa matches from the mid-90s are classics. I love the Kensuke Sasaki match
Yeah.
because it was not just the interpromotional thing, but they built it up in this great O Fortuna video package. It made Sasaki seem like this ultra bully bad guy. And when you see like this strong style stuff of them clotheslining each other and the slow motion replays and the sweat flies off, it's
Yeah.
amazing. But to me, the quintessential Japanese match, and maybe it's because one of the first ones I saw was the Super J Cup tournament in '95, Ultimo Dragon and Jushin Liger. It was just a great junior heavyweight style match. Quintessential Puro match to me.
J-Cups have produced so many
That's
stars.
right.
J
shows,
Crown
yeah.
also.
The Gaijin in the J-Cups are the reason I started watching.
Yeah.
I even searched out the J-Cups.
For those of you who don't know what gaijin is, that is the Japanese slang for a foreigner. And unlike Japanese strip clubs, we're not going to be exclusive here. We want to talk really briefly. What were your favorite gaijin?
He,
Who we do not speak of?
yeah, that guy. He was him and.
I think Dynamite's matches were a little better.
My
though.
favorite match I've ever seen from Japan has absolutely no Japanese wrestlers in it. It's the Bulldogs against Hansen and Gordy. Intense fight. And the funk stuff too. Just an intense fight.
Those guys had awesome tag matches together alone. They had great title defenses over in Japan. Terry, he evolved from the All Japan style and then turned into hardcore style later and the crazy Terry Funk, and still, no matter what, was always entertaining over there.
Stan Hansen. If you take Terry Funk and you add Vader to him, he's a beast. He's
Well,
a
I mean,
scary person.
Stan Hansen was awesome as it was in AWA, but when he went over to All Japan and could just go fucking crazy, holy shit.
When I was a kid, he disgusted me. Slobbering, chaw everywhere.
I think that was the
He
idea.
was a total
Mess.
package. He
And I
could've
was,
But I do want to mention also Hogan, because all this talk about Hogan can't work and do all this sort of stuff, the guy was fucking trained by Hiro Matsuda. I don't think that Hiro Matsuda would let a lug go. But also, when people say that sort of stuff, please check out Hogan Hansen. It was a week after Hogan won the world title in 1991 from Sergeant Slaughter. He went to the Tokyo Egg Dome, had this match with Hansen. You don't see Hogan do that sort of stuff, especially then, and I think Hogan was smart enough to turn it on for Japan, a different sort of style. Hogan and Muta from 93.
Yeah.
So different than the typical Hogan
Well,
match.
look at Hogan when he wrestled the Road Warriors with Tenryu.
You could say Hogan got hardcore in Japan, but that's what we're going to do now. We're going to talk about the best and worst hardcore wrestlers coming up, but I want to thank Alex Payne and Shane Hagedorn for joining the panel. You want to see them managing the tag team champions of Ring of Honor, the American Wolves, who I think are pretty awesome, Davey Richards and Eddie Edwards. Alex Payne in action. Check them out at the ECW Arena, September 10th and 11th coming up, taping for HDNet. You can find out more on ROHWrestling.com, but stick with the Wrestling Roundtable. More when we come back.
On Nokia, you were saying how he'd also put his champions, his heavyweight champion will be fighting in his mixed martial arts fights, lose, be out, and then destroy the credibility of his championship.
That's what I'm saying, it's a credibility. They say, we're the strong style, we're the fighting spirit, and then they get trounced in a minute, like Yuji Nagata.
And if not, I mean, if they do win, they still get hurt and they're injured, they have to vacate the title afterward.
A lot of title vacancies in that.
You know, like if you look at especially New Japan's title history from at least 2000 on, there's a number of vacancies, and it's due to them fighting in MMA and getting hurt, or if they won in MMA, they're still hurt. They can't make the defense the next week or two, or whatever. That's a
very odd thing to do to try and.
I mean, I understand.
It's like risking draw for all.
It's actually it's also stupid for that reason, but it's stupid because you have to remember, like, you want pro wrestling itself to seem real. You don't want to make it like the pro wrestler has to go to the real thing to be real. Or you want pro wrestling. You want it to be like the MMA guy has to come here to prove that he's a good pro wrestler.
That was so much of the idea too of pro wrestling at one point, is that pro wrestling was just another style of
Its
fighting.
own thing, right? It's
not
its own
just
discipline,
like karate or jiu-jitsu or kickboxing. Pro wrestling is its own style,
It's its own style.
and it's the strongest style of fighting that there is.
It's professional wrestling,
and that was the idea.
not amateur wrestling.
All right.